Sweet. Well, I would not consider myself like the end-all be-all master of mixing and mastering, so I just want to be clear. But I've learned from a lot of people on the podcast. I've picked up a lot of tips and tricks along the way, and so that's what I want to share with you today. I produce as Philia, if you don't know that, a Philia, shameless plug. This is a track I'm going to play for you. Once again, if you didn't actually scan this QR code, this is your last chance, I would recommend doing that. And I'm going to show you a track that I've mastered that it's going to release probably in about a month. We're still shopping a couple different labels waiting to hear back. But I'm pretty happy with it, and I'm going to walk you through like my mixing template, how I did what I did, why I did it, and then some concepts. We're going to focus a lot on like bus limiting, bus mixing, routing, some advanced routing things that maybe you haven't thought of, and some other things I've learned. I kind of adopted my own workflow from just pretty much everybody on the podcast I've had, and just looking at like hundreds of templates of people and just figured out what works for me. There's no perfect one size fits all. Like it's not like you're gonna use this template and everything's gonna sound perfect, because everything is subjective in the world of mixing. But let's listen to the finished mix master I have. I tried to get rid of a lot of plugins so it would be more Ableton friendly. So this isn't the final, but it's pretty close. So, thank you. Yeah, the song's called Nostalgia, and I'm pretty happy with it. There's still some maybe little tiny tweaks I want to make to it mixing-wise, but I think for the most part it's done. Yeah, so we'll come back to Ableton and we'll dive in deep into what's going on with all these chains and processing. But some important basic stuff, I know we have some people who are a little newer to mixing and mastering stuff. One of the best pieces of advice is just like pick the right sounds to begin with, and then your mix is going to be easier later. You know, don't clog the toilet of audio. you can see here we've got like our lows, mids, and highs, and pretty much everything in my mind falls into that category. Because if you have like sub bass on top of sub bass, you're just going to destroy the mix from the beginning. It's going to be very cluttered, which is why I use a lot of high pass filters to clean up stuff that's not sub. You probably see or hear that a lot. And mixing is subjective. I think it's not just about using your ears, which I feel like always trust your ears before your eyes, because it's also good to use both. Like I'll use meters and I'll use my ears and listen on different references before I call it finished, which I think is important. But it's also about the feeling. Because like in the end of the day, you could have like the best mix and master in the world, but if the song's garbage, it doesn't matter. You know what I mean? So like I listen to a lot of old tracks from like the early 2000s that were my favorite songs in the world, and I still listen to them and I love them. But now that I go back knowing what I know now, I'm like, these masters are terrible. Like these are horrible mixes, but I love the song, so I still listen to it. It's like great, right? So at the end of the day, I feel like don't obsess over the mastering, don't obsess over the mixing. Like focus on songwriting first, and then the rest will come as you continue to learn. So that's, you can't polish a turd, basically. That's kind of where I'm getting at it. When I'm grouping and bus processing, you'll probably notice in here, I've got like a drums group. I have my sub bass, which actually on this track, I didn't even separate the sub. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. It's all contextual on the track. And then I have a basses group, I have a leads group, and I have a vocals group. So each one of those groups, I'm kind of treating them differently and processing them differently. And they all live in that low, mid, and high frequency zone. But why do we like to group? Why do we like to bus process different tracks? And I think one of the main reasons is just like cohesive energy. So when you're processing, for example, drums, you have a lot of peaks, you have a lot of dynamics, you know, especially in dance music. And a lot of this is like going to change by genre, right? If you're making like smooth jazz, you're probably not trying to hit like -5 lufs, right? That's going to sound bad, actually. So, you know, loudness, processing things, a lot of it just depend on genre and the context of the tracks that you're using. Also mixing smarter. You're not going to have like a cohesive sound if you have just no grouping and everything's its own individual track. Because the dynamics and the way you're processing everything in its own, it's like having a band, but everybody's in their own room, right? Nobody's together. Nobody's actually in the same space. So you can kind of think of it like that. So I think like gain staging by mixing everything and having the volume kind of sitting at its own level in those groups before you get to the master makes a huge difference in how loud you can get your tracks and how tight and like congruent everything sounds. Also, if you do a lot of the processing with limiting or clipping, especially if you're making more aggressive dance music, then your master chain's not going to work as hard. And so your limiter on the master track, you can actually push it a lot harder because you're doing a lot of the gain staging before you get to your master. That's like one of the biggest mistakes I see when people start mixing and mastering is like, if you go to your master and let's go over here, I'll go to my main track and I'll just click this to refresh the peak meter. And as I hit play, if I turn off everything on the master, so there's nothing on the master, let's go to the loudest part of the song, usually a good reference. You can see that I'm still hitting like -9, -10, which gives me plenty of headroom to like continue to smash the sound and do some like, you know, gain staging on the master with like EQ compression, more compression, and some saturation, EQ, other things. So yeah, you get a lighter, more dynamic, happier mix if you have some of that headroom. I see people sometimes, this is like a debate where I see some people just be like, I'm just going to throw a utility on the master at the beginning and turn it down. It's like, well, if you didn't do any of the proper gain staging or work before you get there, it doesn't matter. So that's like something to consider too, which is why I don't really do that. But yeah. Yeah, it's different for every song that I do.
I saw 2 ozones lined right up, and I'm like,
Oh, we'll get into that for sure. I'm going to break all of this down for you guys. Like, I just want to start basic, and then we'll, you know, go deep. So, yeah, for sure. This should be interactive too. So if you have questions, just yell at me. It's totally fine. What was your question?
what's gain staging?
Yeah, gain staging is like the process of building up volume, like track by track, until you get into your master. So if you just start really, really loud, you don't have as much room for all the dynamics, the quietest and the loudest parts to kind of work together. So we're creating enough headroom, which means there's enough room for all the volume to build into, basically.
So yeah, I could be playing like turn like the volume down on recording on certain tracks. And so you basically turn it up on certain tracks.
Yeah, totally. Yep. And then going into the groups, and then you're kind of building up that volume into those groups. And we'll get into limiting in a second, which is kind of building off of that for sure. Yeah, next slide. I don't really condone anything this guy says, but it's a really popular meme. So I feel like it applies. Slamming your master with no headroom versus gain staging, like I showed you, without anything on the master. Usually I'm aiming for that -6 to -10-ish range. It's kind of a nice way to start. If you click the QR code, or if you got that, then you can see exactly my routing process in this chart. I'm not going to go through this right now because I'm actually just going to show you in Ableton how I'm doing it. Or I'm sorry, Ableton Live. By the way, if you guys didn't know, Live is the software, Ableton is the company. If you didn't know that, I saw Alberto peek around the corner. He's like, what did you say? Live. Live is the software that we love and we're using. Anyway, so yeah, treating buses like frequency zones. You've got like your lows, your mids, and your highs, right? Vocals is going to be your mids and your highs. Your bass is going to be, in this instance, I'm destroying bass with saturation, so you're actually getting really all three. And then you've got your drums, that's a lot of your lows and your highs. So thinking about frequency zones, leads, it's not going to be any of my subs. It's going to be all just mids and high range stuff. But you can see the Y over here on the right, if you guys want to look at that too, as well with that QR code I sent you. But let's go deeper. Let's go into the actual project and see what's going on. So this is how I'm treating all my buses. The drums, there's nothing on this drums group. I'm just using it as like an organizational folder, basically. And then I have my kicks and snares. I'm mostly speaking, this project's really for more louder, like dance music, right? It's going to be different. I'm not saying this is the end-all, be-all how you should do it, but this is the rationale for why I did what I did. I have my kick and my snare being processed together, and I've got a kick and then like 2 different snares for like the verse and the drop and stuff. I actually love using drum racks because I just play a lot of my stuff. I have like my electric drum kit, so a lot of times I'll actually play stuff on my kit and then go in and adjust it because sometimes my timing is great, sometimes it's terrible. Yeah, so with that kick and snare, and then I have my drum tops. The drum tops is like hi-hats, tambourines, shakers, cowbells, whatever. And then for the kick and the snare, I have a saturator, which is actually in clip mode. So I choose soft clip, which soft clip is going to be a little more rounding. It's going to sound a little more natural with like really dynamic material. Hard clipping can be really great if you're doing more aggressive sound design, like on, say you want to destroy a bass, or you have like a synth lead that you just want to really cut through. Hard clipping is really great for that. Hard clipping is going to typically be more odd ordered harmonics, and then soft clip is more even, which can sound a little more natural. It just depends on the context of what you're doing with it. And then, so what I did with that is I just drove the sound. You can see the light, this light's up right here in the soft clip. You can see that soft clip light right there in the bottom left is like starting to tick. I'm not slamming it, I just want it to chop off some of those peaks. And what happens when you start chopping those peaks? I'm glad you asked, thank you. If we go here, we can look and we can see that this is what's happening. And this is where it gets fun. I love this kind of nerdy stuff. So like, if you're looking at the waveform right here, you can see how round and beautiful it is, those high peaks and the drops. The highest and the lowest points is like the natural unaffected waveform, right? It's like what we would call a sine wave, basically. And then if you're limiting it, notice how it's rounding. It's actually changing the waveform and how it sounds. That's what's happening when you're limiting. If you are doing over-limiting, aggressively slamming your limiters, or clipping, you're basically flatlining that wave. You're completely chopping it, and you're distorting the waveform. You're completely changing the sound of it at that point, but usually in an intelligent way. A lot of clippers have oversampling. They have like all these other true peaks built into them, so that it's still trying to preserve the waveform. Just remember, the harder you clip, the harder you distort the waveform. How hard you limit, you're actually changing the waveform itself. It's not just squishing the sound of it, right? So down here, if we were to zoom in really, really close on that, oops, if we were to zoom in really close on that waveform at the top, the red is basically aggressive clipping or aggressive limiting really hard. You notice you're actually creating these new harmonics. So you're basically distorting it like you would think of like with a guitar pedal or something, right? Which can sound cool. Like if that's what you're going for, awesome. You know, if you're like Excision or some other of these dubstep artists, like that's their sound. So, but if you're not going for that, then just that's something to be conscious of. Anyway, so then I have the limiter, I have Ableton's limiter, and you see how hard I'm hitting that on the drop with the drums. I've got like minus 2.9, and I'm not trying to destroy the sound. Still doesn't sound terrible, but you can hear it's like the tonality of it is changing. So that versus this. Notice how there's like a white noise on the snare now because those harmonics are being brought out. So that's kind of what's happening there. I usually leave it in standard mode. True peak I find is great for the master. Typically, there's no right or wrong. They just kind of have a different color of sound. What is true peak? Does anybody know what true peak means? No, but it's doing something similar to that. Basically, a true peak limiter is saying that it's not going to cross the ceiling at all. Typically, it's telling the algorithm of the device that if you go past the ceiling, which right now the ceiling is minus 0.2, then you're going to create basically artifacts that when you bounce your track and it's being played in the analog world, like on speakers and stuff, then you might get some weird artifacts in the sound of those little tiny peaks that are crossing that 0 or that 0.2. And that can sometimes make your mix sound a little crunchy, not in a good way. So true peak limiter is basically saying, hey, I don't want this to happen. But it does actually change the sound a little bit. And it's usually a little more transparent, which can be nice. If you want to see exactly what that looks like, this is inner sample peaks. This is what's happening if you cross 0 or if you go past the actual limiter or the ceiling of the output. So right here at the top, this is, let's say, 0 dB. That red line is that extra information that's passing 0. And that can sound really kind of gross sometimes when you export your track and it's being played in the real world. So something to keep in mind, that's what True Peak does. It has a different sound than standard. A lot of times it can be a little more transparent. It just depends on what you're going for. A lot of times you might not even notice the difference. So it's just worth knowing, I feel like, some of these little detailed things. Also, if you turn on maximize, you're actually going to boost the volume as you pull down the threshold. So notice how quiet it is. Limiters and compress. A limiter is a more powerful compressor, basically. A limiter is basically 12:1 ratio and higher from a compressor. So if you're going to throw Ableton's compressor on here and you go past 12 with a ratio, essentially it's just saying that's basically limiting at that point. And compressors, what do? They make louder stuff quieter. That's all it does. But a lot of people think limiters just make stuff louder, but that's only because it's turning up the output volume at the same time you pull down this threshold. That's all it's doing. There's also mid-side mode, which can be really cool if you have a lot of stereo information, say like on my leads track, for my leads bus and stuff. Sometimes using the mid-side mode can really preserve the side information of when you, especially if you're really aggressively hitting a limiter. So that can be a good use case for it. A lot of times I just leave it in left-right sync mode. Because I think it's good when you're mixing to think about not only your lows, mids, and highs, but the stereo information. Like, do you have stuff in the center of the mix versus the sides of the mix? And that's where you can get into mid-side EQ, and we'll dabble in that in a second. But yeah, that's the kick and snare. If we go to the top, yeah.
How did the actual left and right work differently from the mid-side mode?
Yeah, so a lot of times it's compressing a lot of the center information. But it's doing it in kind of an intelligent way. I probably can't tell you exactly more than that because I don't really know, to be honest. But I do feel like it does make the side information a little more like dynamic and bouncy rather than smashing it. It does, yeah, because a lot of the center of the mix, you usually want that to be your low frequencies, like your sub, your kick. It'd be really weird if you panned your kick to the left of the speaker, right? Actually, the Beatles did that. they were like really experimental in that, and that's why they had kind of a unique sound for their time, because they were doing weird stuff with their mixes like that. So there's no right or wrong answer here. I'm just kind of giving the information of what I've learned. But like if you want, really loud dynamic music for the clubs and stuff, it's good to usually mono your sub basses below 100 hertz, or even on 120. But use your ears. Like once again, it's all contextual. So like do what sounds good in the end of the day. Yeah, so the top drums, let's go to this. These are all the hi-hats, the shakers, all these fun little tidbits of thingies. You can hear all this stuff going on. And you'll notice that I have a 12-to-1 ratio, so this is basically soft limiting at this point. And I have a fast attack. The attack is at 12 milliseconds, so it's like super quick. And it's basically catching those immediate peaks. Because a lot of times that really high information, really dynamic stuff can get really kind of harsh and hurt your ears. So I'm wanting it to catch those initial spikes. And then the release, I don't want it to be really long, because you'll notice it's actually holding, it's not bouncy anymore. It just kind of flatlined the sound of how it sounds versus pulling this down. Hear how it's still dynamic, right? You can still hear that pump with all the individual hits and everything going on. So that's basically the release time and the attack time in a nutshell. I do the look ahead like 1 millisecond, sometimes 10 milliseconds. That's just allowing the compressor to see what's coming. Especially if you have a lot of stuff in like a group and a lot of content, sometimes it's good for the compressor to kind of get a heads up. That can induce a little bit of latency, but I find it's so small it doesn't really make a huge difference, unless it does. Yeah.
I'm curious on that, because that's something I've never really messed with. I always just leave it on the default. When
It could be really good for
say you have a lot of
sidechaining.
stuff coming, when's a good use case to?
Especially for sidechaining, because like if you have a lot of dynamic material and it's like coming into the compressor, sometimes it won't react fast enough for like say a kick or a snare, right? Because if you have a ton of stuff in a project and it's getting bogged down, sometimes the compressor won't like see it coming as quickly, and so it might miss some of the attack a little bit.
Do you hear that?
Yeah, you can. If you have a lot going on and if you're like really aggressive with it, sometimes you can, sometimes. But yeah.
Is that only for live playback, or does it always look ahead when it's exporting anyway? Or do you have to have it set to look ahead to sound that way in the master or in the export?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that's a really good question. I think it does compensate for the export. Isn't that right, Orville?
Yeah, it's still, it's processing it earlier, like in real time by shifting everything else back. So
Yeah.
when exported, everything is shifted with that forward look at it happening.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, that's
So
what I
to
thought.
reiterate, like if you have it on 0, if you have it set to 0 or 1, it does the same thing as if it were inside of the exports?
yeah, it's gotta be that same shift forward, like with how it reacts.
Yeah.
Cool.
So, yeah, that was a good question. That was a really good, I had to think about that for a second. I was like, I think that's right. I'm not sure. We should fact check that. We could ask ChatGPT or something. It knows everything. Cool. All right. Or Abe. Yeah, that's right. I just updated him. He knows all the podcast episodes. I'm sure we've talked about that. Cool. So those are the top drums. Any question on the drums before we move on? No? Okay, sweet. So let's go to the basses. So there's a lot of different basses going on here. Like I said, a lot of times I'll separate the sub and have it kind of its own group with just sub frequencies. And a lot of times on that sub, I'll just glue compress it a little bit, and I pull back the attack a little bit because sometimes I don't want the sub to get squashed too much on the front end. Depends what the sub sounds like. If it's like a plucky 808 that's like really dynamic, maybe I will pull this attack to catch it a little faster. But yeah, just pulling down the threshold. Usually I'm not looking for more than like anywhere between 0 to -3 or -4. Because if you over compress your subs, you squish the life out of them and they'll sound flat. They won't sound really like subby and bassy like you want in the big sound system. So that's why I'm not squashing my subs with all these basses, which are usually hitting harder. And then usually I'll just like create an EQ to cut off anything that's not sub, because even if it is just like a sub and you have maybe a little bit of this happening, even if you like have this, there's still a lot of times information happening up here that you don't need in your mix. So if there's a sound that doesn't need any top end like a sub, a lot of times I will, yeah.
When you run like the glue compressor or the saturator, do you run it in high quality mode
Uh, yeah, it depends, because sometimes it really changes the sound because it's oversampling. So oversampling is a whole nother thing. Basically, you're just having new frequencies introduced into itself at like a higher sample rate.
Do you find yourself leaning towards one or the other?
I usually, I don't, because usually I'm oversampling on my master. If it's like the glue compressor on the master, then yeah, I would do that. But on the individual tracks and stuff, sometimes you kind of get like, people are like, oh, aliasing is scary, aliasing is bad, and oversampling prevents that, or high quality mode, same thing. But sometimes, like with aggressive distorted sounds, I want that kind of like weird, fuzzy stuff happening. And it just depends. But yeah, I usually always oversample on my master because it does help prevent some of that. I also oversample on my, I love Pro L for my buses, so that kind of moves us into the basses, and I'll get to the Pro L in a second. I think oversampling and like just the sound of Pro L is really good. Ableton's new limiter does sound really good. I actually really love the new limiter, which I use that sometimes. I usually use it more on individual tracks than I do for bus processing. And we can get into that too if you want, but on the basses group, this is what's going on. Let's solo it. So if I turn off the OTT, we can kind of hear, actually let's just turn all this off and see what we get. Now if I turn on the OTT, I'm basically just compressing and brightening a little bit. OTT just stands for over the top compression. I think a lot of us might know this already. But you've got these different bands. So if I turn this up, you can really kind of hear more what's going on. For this OTT, I like to load the preset and then I usually modify it in different ways. Some different things I'll do with OTT is I'll adjust the attack and release times depending on how dynamic the material is. I left this one exactly as it was, but a lot of times I'll change these. It might be kind of hard to see if you're in the back, but a lot of times I'll change these different ratios. So like I told you, like if you have a 12:1 or higher ratio on a compressor, you're basically soft limiting at that point. And so for this, I'm not really limiting too hard. I drop these. Normally they're at infinity, which just is like a wall. You're just crushing, right? Which kind of gives that cool, aggressive OTT sound that people like. But if you pull it back to like say like a ratio of 9 or something, it's still definitely compressing, but you're allowing the OTT to stay a little more dynamic. You're allowing some of those frequencies to bleed through. And then I like to think of the OTT almost like an EQ at this point. So if I push this band up, this is what we would call upward compression. So when the signal crosses the ratio here below 25 dB, it's actually going to turn up the volume for this band. And then the above side.
Dumb question.
Yeah.
It's a multi-brand compressor, but I always refer to it as OTT as well. Like, at
Yeah.
what point does it stop becoming like the stock device and it's just OTT? Like, what makes OTT so?
OTT is just an extreme version of multiband. Yeah, it's just a multiband compressor at the end of the day. Yeah, exactly. But
Everybody call it whatever the settings are. Yeah, put OTT.
I mean, the preset has really kind of developed its own like brand. Like, I mean, you have people making plugins of this preset. So, I mean, that's become a real thing. You have Xfer, creating their own OTT plugin, and a lot of times when I load it, I don't leave it at 100%, which you can. That's cool if you want to do some really cool sound design. A lot of times I'll just back that amount off, and I put this on a lot of stuff. I put it on my lead synths. I put it on like some aggressive like front basses in the mix, not subs, but like more aggressive like sounds. Then I back off the amount, but just to hear what it sounds like, let me turn this up to like 50%. And as I was saying, like if you pull up this band, you've got these different crossovers. So you got like 3.25 kilohertz, you've got your lows here, and you could turn these bands off too if you want. So that gives you some options of like, oh, I only want to process the top end and make it brighter. You could just turn off the low frequencies here, or the mids. And just play around with it, like load it onto a sound or a fat synth and just like see what kind of different settings do different things. That's the best way to learn. And then, yeah, so like let's hear what it sounds like. Notice how bright that is if I just crank this all the way to the top. Now let's pull it down. So as I was saying, this is downward compression. If I take this top band and I push it to the left, we're actually pushing down on that top frequency of anything above 3.16 kilohertz. So now you'll notice it gets warmer. So think of it as an EQ in that sense, right? You're like, oh, this needs to be a little bit brighter, but I also want to control the dynamics and make it a little more aggressive and in my face. This is a really great way to do that. Same thing for the mid-range. Maybe there's like way too much mid stuff going on. I'll just squish down some of that mid-range. Maybe I need more mid-range. So let's just play around with it. And then a lot of times I'll just find that happy place and just turn down the amount to where it just makes sense. For me, I only had this at like 9 or 10%, so it was like very minimal, not doing a lot. I'm just kind of giving everything a little group hug and just making it a tiny bit brighter and more squished together, because I have so many different sounds in this group, as you can see right here. There's a lot going on. So I need to kind of keep everything like it feels like it's in one place. So not doing a whole lot here. And then if we go to the compressor, you'll see how hard I'm hitting this. Let me actually turn all this off again real fast. Turn back that OTT on. And then I got the glue compressor. So if I turn this on, you can see I'm only hitting it maybe -1, -2 dB. I didn't change any settings on this. And then if I go to my saturator, I'm actually soft clipping it, because I have a lot of really aggressive sounds and stuff, and some of them might spike a little too aggressive, a little too loud, so I'm just really shaving off just the tippy tops of the peaks to kind of say, okay, this might be a little too much here, this might be a little too much here, only on certain sounds. Not every sound is getting clipped, just a lot of the loudest ones, and just a tiny bit, yeah.
So why use the saturator and like?
Because I think this sounds good.
As opposed to like a limiter or like a compressor to do that.
I just like the sound of the clipping feature inside of it. I think it's really good.
Drive?
Yes, so in order to have it clip for this,
You gotta hit the drive.
if the drive's at 0,
Yeah.
you notice it's not clipping at all. This light, it's not even lighting up. So like, that light's not even turning on.
Pushing 7 dB into it on the utility just on the other side, which like you got your.
Oh, I'll get there, yeah.
Okay, 'cause, like, I guess
Yep.
the makeup thing, I'm surprised
So
that
that's another important thing to think about.
It seems like you're doing something with that saturation.
Yep. So I turned off the color too, because this does color the sound a little bit, and so if you turn it off, it's a little more transparent. I didn't want to color. I've already did a lot of processing on the individual tracks, well, some of them, and I wanted them to, still have some life to them. I didn't want to over color it because it's, I just wanted. All I want to do is just clip for this. I'm not trying to change the tonality of a lot of stuff, and I like analog clip setting. So yeah, soft clip, I turned up the drive until I just start to see a little bit of that light flickering. And then I turned down the output the exact same amount. And this is the gain staging part that we talked about. Because if you just keep on turning stuff up, notice I have the makeup gain here. As I'm compressing, it's turning down the volume so that I'm bringing a little bit of that makeup gain back up. But then that's also getting louder as it goes into the saturator, right? So, because then I'm driving it another 4 dB. So I just raised it between these two devices. I just turned up the volume 8 dB. So it's already getting pretty loud from the start. So that's why in the output, that's why I love the new auto filter.
Push another 7 dB on top of it.
Yeah, I'll get there for a second. Yeah, we'll get there. So if I turn down the output, then I'm basically saying, okay, I'm not actually changing the amount of headroom that I'm really pushing here on the saturator. It's basically back at 0 pretty much, but it's also clipping, so really it's a little less than 0. But then I go to the utility, and you might be like, Dan, why are you cranking this up 6.67 dB?
Never asked that question.
You're right, of course. It's obvious, right? But then if you turn on bass mono, I'm monoing everything in my basses group below 170 hertz. Like I said, a lot of times on big speaker systems, if you have everything super wide, including your subs, sometimes things can get a little phasey. You actually get more power in your low end if the sub, usually below 150 hertz or so, it stays in the center of the mix. And that's usually where your kick and bass live, and that's where everything else can breathe on the sides of the mix outside of that, like your leads and other instruments and vocals and stuff. So then I turn up the gain, right? The utility doesn't change this color of the sound, really. It's just basically a volume knob at this point, and I just centered the bass sub-frequencies. But then I turn on my Pro L2. So if we look at this, you'll see how hard I'm hitting everything. And you can see See, it's just shaving off the top. That might only be dropping like 1 dB of gain reduction, right? So it's just saying once it gets to that ceiling, once it hits that 0, it's going to push it down 1 dB as it needs to. It's going to push it down and control those loudest parts. And that's going to make my mastering chain a lot happier because it doesn't have to work as hard. It's saying, okay, like I'm controlling the craziest dynamics before I get to the master, and then everything can get pushed up again, so we get a lot more volume.
I've tried to stay the stock for the most part, but everybody swears by Pro-L.
I think it sounds really good.
I mean, you had other kind of traditional stock limiters.
Sure.
The previous, I think, chain there.
Totally. We could use Ableton's limiter.
Granted, I know it's kind of, it depends, but what's the rule of thumb? Like, start simple, and if you need more, go Pro-L?
Yeah, I don't think anybody needs to buy plugins. Honestly, like that's like the truth of the matter is like there's a lot of plugin hoarders out there who like spend their life savings on plugins and they never release music. And it's just like
Out of all the companies that are out there, they're expensive, but like everybody swears by them.
I feel like for me personally, and everybody has their own opinion, I think there are a few tools that are worth buying to have like in your arsenal of things to use, specifically when it comes to mixing and mastering. Because there are companies and they have really talented teams of people who are really good at doing a specific thing. And not that, Ableton obviously has a lot of talented coders. There's a lot of really great devices. The new limiter is fantastic. I think it's great. You could still use that. I just think if you have the extra cash to spend, there are a few things that are nice to have as extra shiny toys, right? Not that you have to have them. 99% of every listener isn't going to be like, I bet that guy didn't use Pro-L on his master. Like, damn. If you would have only used Pro-L, this mix would have been really good. That's not going to happen, right? But for us, everybody in this room, we might be like, yeah, that sounds just like maybe minus 0.05% better or whatever. Like, so it's a small thing, but yeah.
On the Pro-L, I saw you just left the channel linking to like the default. Do you ever turn those off?
You can. Yeah, you definitely can. I don't really play too much with it. I just never really found too much of a need to. You can. It's basically what's going on over here with the mid-side routing in Ableton. You just get 2 options, which is kind of sometimes less options nicer.
Yeah.
You just trust it.
I got like a tip from Long Story Short,
Mm.
and he basically, he said, he's like, yeah, I just always turn those all the way off, just because I guess it kind of gives it a little bit of a cleaner overall.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, if it does, then go for it. I think that's fantastic. Once again, I don't know if there's a perfect solution for every answer. I think a lot of it is just case by case and use your ears and what sounds good. Orville.
A side note on that, like when you keep if you turn the link down to like less than 100%, you're able to limit the left and the right channels independent of each other, and that can result in pumping like a little bit more volume out of the overall, especially for a master or something like that. But you kind of pay for it by losing some of the stereo imaging that you preserve. So I kind of, when I'm mastering, I kind of go back and forth. Like, do I want to make sure I'm staying as stereo as the mix is intended to, or is it more important for it to be louder? So sometimes I'll go like in the middle, and you can balance that off.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good pro tip. We're glad you're here. It's wonderful. Cool. So then you were asking, why am I pushing 6 dB of gain a little higher? I only got like 10 minutes. Cool. If you push what I'm doing is I'm creating a ceiling, and I heard Ahi talk about this, and he like shared some really good insights and things he's tested with this, is like, if you start turning up this gain, which is fine, then you're going to start boosting that volume, right? So I'm going to be hitting this a little bit harder. Let me turn this down. It's getting quite a bit louder. You're also going to lose any sub that's in that group, because you're just going to smash the highest, the brightest stuff, and the subs are going to start to become a wall. And you're going to actually lose some of that sub energy because it's going to try to compensate for all the other frequencies that are happening. So a lot of times what we're doing with this bus limiting is I'm not touching the gain because I don't want it to turn up the output volume. I've already done kind of the gain staging to where I want it to be, where stuff sounds good before I hit this Pro-L limiter. And then I'm just saying, okay, I just want the stuff that's the really loudest stuff to get shaved off. So that creates a little more headroom for me to go into my master. And if I turn up the gain, it's actually going to be boosting the output volume. And I'm not trying to boost the output volume necessarily. I'm just creating a wall, basically. So leaving that at 0. I also think it's worth noting, we talked about those inner sample peaks. It does have a true peak limiting feature in here, which I think works pretty well. But just to be safe, a lot of times I will go to the output level and I'll set the ceiling at like -0.2 or -0.3, just to kind of keep that as like a safe bet that there's not going to be inner sample peaks that are crossing over. And even though this has true peak limiting, I say like 99% of the time, it probably does that, a really good job of that. But sometimes there's that chance, so I just set -0.2 just for funsies, just for whatever reason. And then oversampling, we talked about a little bit of that. You're going to prevent aliasing, which is basically you're going to have some information that's outside of the sample rate that's going to be folding back in on itself, and you're going to create some extra frequencies that don't exist in your mix when you bounce and export into the world for the frequencies that the computer's reading out. So a lot of times anything below 4 times oversampling doesn't really make a lot of a difference, especially if you're hitting a lot of limiters pretty hard. So I usually do 4 times. Also, if you turn up oversampling on plugins like this, just remember that you're gonna pay for it in CPU, so it's gonna tax your computer harder. My computer's about to cry really hard, so I left this off. But yeah, I usually do 4 times oversampling on the buses and the master. The master, if my computer handle it, usually I'll go to like 16 or 8. It'll be great. So that's what's going on with the Pro L. Then this is my favorite sidechaining option. I'm actually sidechaining to the kick and the snare. The kick is actually pretty heavy hitting, or I'm sorry, the snare is hitting pretty hard. So when we're looking at this, that snare's got a lot of low body to it. It's got that like booty thump sound, you know, it's kind of like that nice little so that is fighting some of that information, and I'm sidechaining it really fast. I have the release at like 45 milliseconds, so it's just smacking and letting go really quick, and this is the snare over here. And you can see, oops. And the nice thing about this is you can actually like zoom in and actually see what's going on in the waveform. So you can really kind of dial in, scroll over, see like, oh, that's a nice shape. That's the transient that's hitting right there of that snare, that initial smack. And I just want it to basically jump out of the way. So if you have like a lot of aggressive basses or synths and all this stuff that's hitting and smacking, sidechaining the kick especially, but also the snare in this instance. I don't always sidechain the snare, by the way. It just depends. Depends on the snare and what's going on. But for this, there's a lot of fuzzy, aggressive sounds. So I wanted that snare smack to really cut through and hit. And then, yeah, I set the release time to 45 milliseconds. It also has a hold, which is nice. So that's just the time that it holds on to the sustain of this smack before it kicks into the release. So if you add these up together, you're really hitting like 60 milliseconds total. But then, yeah, then there's the amount. So you can actually drop the amount if you don't want to fully sidechain and carve out the sound every time that snare hits. So you can, yeah, let me zoom out of that a little bit. Anyway, so that's the amount. I did 100% because I wanted to completely jump out of the way for a short instance. And then the kick over here, you can see how hard the kick's hitting. And you can see right there on this kick, I'm not completely, see there's some yellow crossover here. I'm not carving out the entire kick. I'm just trying to cut out some of the body where a lot of that low sub is thumping. And because if you carve out too much, like if I pull out the release to like really high and then we play it, you'll hear the bass is just really jumped out of the way. If that's the effect you want, that's cool. But for me, I'm just focusing on just getting those sub frequencies with my kick to not fight each other. So I have usually a pretty moderately fast release or whatever. Yeah. Any questions on that? This is my favorite. It's called GM Audio Ducker. I've played with so many different sidechaining options in Ableton Live's 8 compressor with ghost clips, and I think we talked about that last year, but this is the fastest, easiest option that's low latency that I found. Yeah.
Do you ever do multiband sidechaining?
Yeah, totally. If you wanted to.
You can still kind of keep some of the top end.
Sure. You could totally create one with this. All you would really need to do is just like create a split frequencies. You create a rack, so you just group it. You can go in here and you can create a new chain. You could create multiple chains if you want low, mid, high, you know, and then you basically just carve that out. You could use an EQ if you wanted to, but you could separate it with EQs and create like a low and a high. You could do it that way. If I was going to do that specifically, I probably would just use Pro MB because I have it, and I like Pro MB a lot. It's crazy. They haven't made a Pro MB 2 in a long time. This has been out for forever. But yeah, you can create those crossovers here, and then you can sidechain. If you open this up, you can do external, and then you could route to the kick. I would just go to the kick, and then, oops, it'd be kick snare rack. I would just find the kick basically here. I'd try to do pre-effects because there is some post-processing on the kick, like EQ and some other compression and stuff that I don't really need it to listen to. So it's just lower latency, I feel like, if you don't have a bunch of post-processing. So yeah, totally. You could do Pro Q as well. Pro MB's, I think, great. It's a nice multi-band compressor that you can also you can do some external sidechaining with here.
So what made you decide to duck the entire bass in this project versus doing a multi-band?
Because I felt like I wanted the kick had a nice little top punch on it, and I felt like it just hit nicer. It's a pretty bodied sounding kick. It's not like a little snappy kick, you know, like if you had for maybe garage or some other genre or something. So it's a pretty full-bodied fat kick, so I just want it to really pop all the way through the mix. Yeah, good question. Leads, basically, one of my favorite things in the world is using a dynamic EQ on your leads, especially for group processing before the limiter, because a lot of times you have I found that the mix was like getting a little boomy, and I love Pro Q. There's 4 now, I'm still on 3, but if you right-click a band, if you create a band and right-click on it, you can choose Make Dynamic. And the nice thing about dynamic EQs is it's not always carving, right? If I just make a regular band and I carve, no matter what's playing, it's always going to cut that sound out. And I've got a lot of different sounds. I've got synths, I've got horns, I've got other things, and that's going to start to carve out things that I don't want to carve out. So that's the beauty of a dynamic EQ is once the signal crosses this threshold, then it's going to duck it. Otherwise, it's not doing anything. So that's really nice. You can actually make one with live stock devices. You can use an envelope follower, and you can basically choose the map here. I usually go to remote so you can visually see what's happening. But you can click that, and then you can click the gain on this band. So you'll see if I map it. Oops, let's go. Oh, it's because it's already. Oh, let's go back. You'll see that if you turn up this gain, then it's going to duck this when that signal gets loud in that certain frequency range. So you can make your own dynamic EQ with the envelope follower and EQ. For the sake of time, I'm probably not going to go too much deeper in that, but the rise and the fall is your attack and release time on this. And then you have another OTT I modified a little bit. I dropped some of the ratios so it's not compressing as hard, only like a 4%, it's barely on. A little bit of subtle compression, and then there wasn't a lot of volume. It's actually really quiet without this utility. And then I'm pushing that into the ceiling right here, which I see is just basically 0. We're chopping off some of those loudest parts. See those horns? Some of those horns right here were really punchy, so I want to control some of that. Same thing, I actually just copy and paste the GM audio ducker onto here from the sub bass so that they're hitting at the exact same time. I feel like GM audio ducker is actually really CPU friendly, so I'm not worried about like sidechain wobbliness or whatever. Also just feeling lazy. And then also we have vocals. So vocals, I'm actually processing a lot of the vocals individually. These are samples, not like an actual recorded vocal, so like that would be a whole different thing. I'd process that very differently and spend more time on it. But for this, I just basically kind of had some auto pan just for some fun effects and wiggles and moving the stereo placement of sounds. I do that a lot on my percussion stuff. And then I just basically compress the vocals. So when you have that. Yep, so I'm not really smashing it, I'm just gain reducing it to like -5 at the loudest parts with that threshold, pulling it down. And then the FX group, same thing. I've got a lot of risers and sweeps and little fun, little chimey sounds. So I actually cut that off with an EQ. Oh, let me go back to the leads. I also want to mention that I did cut off the sub here. Like anything above 100 or anything below 109 hertz is getting gradually rolled off because I don't need that. My sub's already hitting pretty hard, and I want there to be room for that frequency range to breathe. One thing worth mentioning. And then pre-master. Let's talk about chains. So it's cool. Sometimes I don't actually use this, but I find if you need some really loud volume, then doing like basically serial bus limiting is a really great way to get that extra volume and really smash stuff while still sounding nice and loud. So you'll notice in my kick and snare, I'm sending out just the kick and snare to chain 1. So if you go in here and route it, choose chain 1, and then that's going here, and it's just a limiter. And I pull down the threshold with maximize on, so it's actually boosting it as it's compressing a little bit. And then I also am sending my basses to that same chain. And the reasoning, this is actually kind of a modified Skrillex routing. He does some crazier stuff than this too in his newer stuff, but basically you're treating similar groups in same frequency zones together, and you kind of create this like dynamic squished cohesiveness and making it louder at the same time in a nutshell without going too deep. And so I'm doing that with chain 1. It's the kick and snare and the bass. It's all in the chart that I shared with you, actually back here. It's all right here. And then also I have, for my chain 2, I am sending my top drum, so it's all the mid-range bright stuff with my leads. And those are being treated in chain 2 together. And you can see how hard I'm actually really hitting those. Let's go to the loudest part, the drop, say. Might be louder in the verse for chain 2. Yeah, it's barely doing anything for that. It's just a little extra control. I'm not really smashing stuff too hard. For the bass and the drums, let's see what that's hitting at. Let's see where the chain 1 is. Yep, so that's like -1 dB. It's hitting a little bit harder because your bass and your drums are usually the loudest frequencies that are happening in your mix. Not a lot of time left. Let's go to the master. The glue compressor, I have the slowest attack and the fastest release because I don't want this to grab and hold on to stuff. I want everything to stay lively and dynamic. So if I have a slow attack, it's letting everything come through before the compressor reacts, and it's letting go of the tail of stuff. So it's just really kind of controlling some of those faster, pumpy things that are happening. And you can see I'm and then I did an EQ8, and I just dropped it like -0.3 for the lows. I felt like there's just kind of a lot of times I do that just because I want to roll off some of the lows just a tiny bit if it's a lot of bass heavy stuff. And then I did a multi-band compressor. Notice that I set the ratios to 1.75, which means it's barely working at all. So a lot of the stuff I'm doing on the mastering chain is not extreme at all. It's like little moves to kind of control the dynamics and slowly build it up one by one. And then you can play with these frequency bands to kind of see where that crossover is. And I pulled the these lower bands all the way down and set it to 1:1, so it's basically not even activated at all. 1:1 ratio just means it's not even on, nothing's happening. So then I'm just creating this wall. These top bands, like I said, are pushing down. So it's downward compression happening, and it's basically just saying anything that hits those are just going to be controlled. And if I need my brightness to be a little controlled, I'll push down on this top one a little bit, vice versa, you know, whatever else. Notice it does actually make everything a little brighter. which is kind of nice if I want to brighten stuff and tighten stuff. I did the same thing over here with a slightly different, I mean, it's pretty much the same. What did I do here? I don't remember. But yeah, it's pretty much the same, very similar. Doing it in parallel and just blending the amount. This is a vintage finalizer. All I'm really doing is playing with the saturator. You actually have this rack if you scan that QR code, so you have this whole first part of the rack that I just showed. And then usually I'll just play with the saturator. And it's, if you are distorting stuff, you're going to make it louder because you're introducing new frequency harmonics into the mix, right? So if you feel like a lot of mixes aren't getting loud enough, you might not be like saturating or softly distorting stuff. Which can definitely be a way to get your mixes more present, more front in your face. But obviously, you can always overdo anything, right? So there's that balance there. But then using the EQ3, I rolled off the sides completely. You can do this with the Ableton's EQ. Basically, you have the mid side. So if you go to EQ8, you can go in here. And then if you go to mid side mode, go to mid side, and you roll it off on the sides. Oops, that was the mid. Go here, change it to S, so that's the side. And then you can roll off. Usually I'll roll off the master to like 120 hertz, somewhere in that range. And that does keep your like low end frequencies in the center and preserve that sub to hit really hard. But not too hard, right? Like hard in a good way as it's centered and it's like balanced, not like it's louder. And then, yeah, I did some little bit of dynamic EQ here in the mid-range. One of my favorite quotes, like my friend Corey Miller, he did mixing and mastering for Eminem and like B.O.B. and a lot of the great old cats like in the hip-hop world. And he always said, like, he taught me a lot of mixing stuff. He's like, the best mastering engineers mastered the mid-range, and just decent mastering engineers master the lows and highs. Because the mid-range is where most of our ears are tuned in, right? Between 500 hertz to 2K is usually where like our natural listening range, that's the human voice. That's where our ears naturally tune in, right? So if you can control a lot of frequencies in that range, stuff just naturally sounds tight. So it's like, that's something to think about too. And then Ozone, this is a fun tool. Actually, this is the imager. I don't really do a ton of imaging. This is like a special case scenario on my master, because usually I do that on the individual tracks. Like if something needs to be wider, usually I'll go to that track and be like, this synth needs to be a little wider on the individual tracks. But I found the overall mix could have just been a little bit wider, so I did some of that. This is Ozone 11. There's a free Ozone, or free Imager 2 plugin. So you can download that for free, and it's very similar. It just doesn't have the frequency crossovers. So what I like to do with this is I like to hit play. Let me move these around. And then you create these bands, and then you just hit learn up here, and it'll actually do the crossovers for you. It listens intelligently, and I usually play the drop or like the main hook. Canceling the sound in itself. Another thing to do with that is check in mono. So a lot of times I'll throw a utility on my master and just hit mono. And if stuff just disappears completely or gets really quiet, it's like, okay, it's probably out of phase. I might need to go check with that. Maybe I used way too much of multiple chorus effects, or maybe I like widened something way too wide. Like hyperdimension and serum, I actually love using that for widening stuff, like the serum effects. I think that's like a really fun way, but you can overdo it and throw stuff out of phase really easy. But yeah, this is utility. And then I did, we're like way over time. Then basically with that, I did that. And then this is like a new fun like little thing in my tool shed. Enzo was on the podcast recently, and I love his music, and he makes really good sounding stuff. And he would like really turn me on to this. It's the Ozone 11's low end focus. Basically you just have like one crossover point. I usually set it to around like 200 or so. And then you've got this contrast. If you turn it up, it's actually going to take the relationship in the low end below 200 hertz, mostly your sub and your kick, right? And you're going to take that, and it's going to kind of change the relationship with whatever algorithm's going on under the hood, and it kind of tightens it and makes it more punchy. So the relationship, a lot of times in that low frequency range between 150 to like 300, it can sound boomy. Stuff can sound really muddy. So sometimes if that happens, I'll go to the individual tracks and I'll do an EQ and kind of duck that where it's needed in like the lead basses or subs or something. This also helps on top of that. So usually I don't do anything extreme, but I'll turn this up a lot of times to get some of that tight punch out of it. So that's another option. If you have ozone, I think it's in 11 and 12. It might be in 10. I'm not sure. Is it in 10? Okay, sick, nice. Yeah, I've only used it in 11. Yeah, 12's insane if you play with that. Yeah, we can if you want to nerd out on 12 later, let me know. But yeah, standard clip. This is one of my favorite clippers. It's really ugly. It looks like Windows XP. Looks like Windows 95. But anyway, yeah, so then I just turn on oversampling a little bit here. Notice you'll see it's just chopping off the peaks. If you clip before your master limiter, you actually get more headroom back and you can hit the limiter harder because the clipping is doing a lot of the work for you for the limiter. So in other words, you could think of it like it's basically giving the waveform a little haircut, and then the limiter is like doing the shampoo and conditioner. Think of it in that way. So that's kind of what's happening. You're chopping it. You're chopping the sound, which is going to make it aggressive, and you can definitely overdo it if you wanted to. But then the limiter is going to round off those chop peaks and make it kind of sound a little more natural again sometimes. So that's usually what I do. I'll usually clip before my master limiter, and you could use Ableton's soft clip if you wanted to. That's an option. I usually turn the color off so it's more transparent, or you could use something like K-clip or standard clip. There's other good clippers out here, but you can see how hard I'm actually hitting that. Hitting that limiter like, -5, -6 or something, and just pulling down this threshold with maximize on, auto release. And yeah, so last but not least, one of the best things I could ever recommend is downloading Span. I love Span. It's a good visual tool. Let's just see where we're hitting with this. I like to key map Span, so if you go into key mapping mode, up here, click key, and then I'll click on the plugin window so it opens. Then I just click that, and I always reference this way. So I'm constantly going back and forth and just saying. And if you take your cursor, you can see the top of the waveform and how loud it is. I used to measure a lot of my tracks by LUFS, and I don't do that anymore because LUFS is only measuring certain loudness over a short period of time. And what this is doing is just measuring mostly peaks, but you can get a consistent read with this, especially if you go to the settings and change it from the block size to the default, which is 2048. If your computer can handle it, which mine might start crying, but if you go to 4096, it's a little faster, so you can kind of see more of the dynamics of what's happening in real time. It will tax your computer a little bit more. I can hear my computer's about to take off flight right now. But yeah, then you also have a phase meter over here. If it's going more to the right, that means you're in phase. If it's hitting left, that means you're out of phase. But I'll usually do this, and I'll go back and correct stuff. So like I had that dynamic EQ on my leads. If I hit play, I noticed sometimes stuff's really loud in the mid-range. So then I went through and I did a dynamic EQ, and I pushed it down a little harder in that mid-range on the group or on the individual track. So I usually like my subs to be hitting about the same loudness on the main hook or the main part of the track as the brightness up here. So just even using your ears first always, and then visually seeing like, okay, my subs, see how loud my sub's hitting, probably around -29. That's usually what I aim for on the loudest part of the song. And then the brightness usually around somewhere in there. Not to say it has to be exactly the same, because it doesn't, but it's a good reference, so. And our ears naturally kind of want to sometimes see a little dip around here in the 200 hertz sometimes. It all is contextual, right? So sometimes if you want your mix to sound warmer or whatever, you don't have to follow these rules. But this is just kind of a reference point to do that. Yeah.
What's the limit setting band using span over like let's say per cue to visually see what's going on? Is it just more precise when
Yeah, I think this is more precise in some ways. And it's also like just more customizable, I guess. Like you can visually see this. I also do like to go into Pro Q even if you just load a basic Pro Q on a track, like for the basses and the leads. I think I have Pro Q on my basses, didn't I? No, I don't. So if I just load a Pro Q on here, this would be a nice feature for Ableton to add into EQ8. If I just load it here and I'm not even doing anything, I think I can even, I think I have to leave it on for monitoring. But if I go to the leads and then I go to my Pro Q3, you can actually change the analyzer to that bass group. So if I click basses, now you can actually see in real time how they're comparing in the frequency range. So if you have like maybe 2 synths stacked or something and you like, it sounds too muddy, I need to EQ one of these, you can visually just see where they're fighting. So you could you'll notice this leads is hitting really hard here. Some of that bass is up here. Maybe I want to go through on that sound and duck some of the basses here so they kind of have, you know, it's like Play-Doh. You're just like squishing stuff and carving out space for stuff to live.
With that in mind, I mean, you opened up and said, you know, you might do a few more small things. Who are you doing those for? Because, I mean, it sounds fantastic.
Oh, thanks.
Are you doing it for yourself?
Yeah, mostly, I think so. I mean, there's a lot of, I mean, it's all about just referencing. And that kind of brings me home to like the final point, which is listen on different speakers in different places. Like you can definitely get stuck in loop hell when it comes to mixing and mastering. I think all of us have experienced that maybe at some point in our life where you just keep listening to the same thing over and over and you're like, at one point it was great and now it's worse. And then you just like question the meaning of life and you're not sure what's going on anymore and then you hate it and everybody else still loves it but you never release it. So it's good, you know, if you want to have other people master your tracks and mix your tracks, great. I understand there's definitely good reasons for that. I think it's valuable to learn that stuff at some point because your productions naturally are just going to sound better even if you hand it off to somebody else to do it. So that's just my tip of the day. Also, a couple of final things when it comes to referencing. I load in a reference track. I think a reference track is one of the best ways to get your music to sound good. If you're not referencing your mixes, 100% recommend it. Some people don't. Good for them. I don't care. I still reference. I think that, so what I do is I key map it. This is like a nice little fast workflow. If you hit key map, and then I'll hit solo, and I'll solo the reference track, and then I'll go to my main track, and I'll group all the things on the mastering chain, so everything being treated is getting turned off, so I'll group it, and then I'll basically hit the off button. So then when I go back, I just hit that button on my computer, and notice it solos the reference track, and then it turns everything on my mastering chain off. Because it would be terrible if you just played your reference track through your whole chain and then your speakers explode and your ears are bleeding. So that's not fun. Don't do that. And then, yeah, so now you can go back and forth and then it's really rewarding when you hear another track and you're like, mine sounds better. That's like, that's the best feeling in the world. It is quite a bit louder. It's quite. Thank you. I actually love this song though. Common Creation. He makes some really cool stuff. But I was like, I feel like mine sounded better. Thank you. And I think a lot of it has to do with those pre-master chains too, and the bus processing, which is what I really wanted to focus on today. Last but not least, I'm sorry we're way over time. I would say quiet level referencing is huge. Going back and forth comparing like how did his drums sit, how did my drums sit, pulling up span as you're referencing for sure. You know. I don't know what just happened.
Mid-side mode on Span?
Say what?
Do you use the mid-side mode on Span?
No.
You see like the stereo information too?
Where?
I think maybe
Up here at the
that
top?
stereo button, or maybe
What?
click that little arrow. Yeah, you can see the side information as well.
I'm not sure what just happened. Something got weird. Oh, cool. Yeah, I'll have to play more with that. That sounds like a fun little tool.
Yeah, it was really helpful.
One thing Dennis DeSantis said about mixing is like, there's fun things you can do. Like if you're listening to the mid-range and the brightness and you want to know what's really going to stand out, then listen quietly or take your headphones off and just rest them on your shoulders and flip them up. And then just listen at like a medium loudness and you'll immediately hear what stands out in the mix. So like trying alternative ways to like listen rather than just like in your speakers in your spot where you're always at. Turn off your monitor, listen with your eyes closed. Like there's a lot of things like get out of your comfort zone and how you're perceiving the sound. Also, I use headphones a lot for dialing in reverb tails and delays. So reverb and delays, I always double check those in headphones because you'll hear what's really going on. And I usually dial back my reverb. Typically, I always lean on less reverb, especially if you're going to play in a live club or studio environment or a live club environment. Sometimes, depending on the room, if it's not well treated, it gets really messy and muddy. Export settings, last but not least. What do you guys use?
Use 48.
You do,
32.
okay.
Depth 32, 48.
Do you distribute for that that way?
What do you mean?
Do you like send that for distribution? Okay.
No, that's more, if it's distribution, then yeah, 44, 100,
Yeah.
and 24.
Yep, that's the standard now. And there's lossless on Spotify, and a lot of like streaming services are going lossless. That's the future. So
44, not 48?
yeah, 44 is like the streaming standard. Also, if you're going to play out in CDJs and stuff and you want other people to play your tracks, you want to go 44.1. And then 24-bit is usually good. If you want to distribute CDs, you have to go 16-bit and then dither. And if you're dithering, I usually use POWR3 is more for louder dance music, if that's what you're making, for 16-bit only. If you're at 24-bit, the bit depth is so high, the headroom and the resolution is so high that you don't need to dither. Does anybody want to know what dithering is that doesn't know? Do we all know what dithering is? It's just adding noise. It's natural noise, it's a little fuzz that makes it more sound, so it makes the computer have the song sound more natural to the human ear. That's basically what it is. It's like if you take your hand like this and you put it in front of your face, you can't see. But if you start doing this, you can still see. That's dithering, basically. Yeah, that's pretty much it. The end. Thanks, guys. This is good stuff. All right, right on. So we are going to take a, we got an hour. What time is it? It's 12:50. Let's get back here. Let's see, today is Saturday. All right, let's all come back here let's be back in this room no later than 2 p.m. if we can. That'd be perfect. Yeah, let's be back at 2. So you guys, there's a lot of places for lunch, walking distance. But yeah, let's be back here by 2. Yeah, we're going to lock the room, so if you guys want to leave stuff in here, you can. That's a good question. We'll make sure it's all locked.